Plenty of controversy, which is exactly what all the networks and what college football is clamoring for with the expansion to the 12-team playoff. We have more of it as Alabama, they're in the bracket, and they're not leaving. Here's your bracket projection as we go into the final week with Selection Sunday coming up at noon Eastern on Sunday afternoon. Oregon remains in the top spot, followed by Texas and Penn State. Again, when they rank these, they put them in pods of 3. They're top 3 by the committee: Oregon, Texas, Penn State. The next group, Notre Dame in at 4. That comes into play when we get to the bracket in a moment. Georgia and Ohio State in the top 6. Tennessee, the top team out of Tier 3 for them, followed by SMU and Indiana. And then Boise State, Alabama, and Miami finish out your top 12 with the rankings, not the bracket. Because remember, your top 4 conference winners automatically get the bye, and you'll have the at-large team as well based on how the bracket plays out. That means Bama is in, Miami is out, and, well, SMU and Boise State get the bye. And Ohio State, based on the bracket right now, hosts Tennessee, not the other way around, which is the way that Chad and I discussed we would have it, and the way that the AP poll had it, and more. Now, on the initial rankings, Tennessee is actually the 7th seed. So if things were just lined up properly and you had the top 4 of the ranking host or get the bye, Tennessee be hosting a game. But it's not the way the bracket and the playoff is set up. Therefore, Ohio State gets the home game despite losing to Michigan last weekend.
Yeah, and I know that to get all the conferences to go along with this plan, that was part of the thing, right?
The
was to make sure
money.
they get in, and they get the double bye if you win as a conference champion and all of that. I would honestly prefer just to have the top 12 at this point, the way it goes, and seed it out that way. But I understand why they did all this and why they did what they did. I'd like to be the first to congratulate Heather Dinich on nailing it once again.
She did.
Just pointed out everything was going to happen. Magically, mysteriously, Heather Dinich knew exactly what her network, ESPN, was going to unveil on Tuesday night with the selection committee. So congrats once again to Heather.
And Chad, I mentioned yesterday that the network matchups and just thinking about what they could do versus what they would do, that certainly comes into play with all the arguments about, most deserving. And you've seen a lot of that. What Heather Dinich knows, and what I think we certainly came to conclusion of in just discussing things out, it's not most deserving. It is best team. That's what they're debating in the room. But best team in this scenario also equals best ratings because Alabama's in. They're the king of the mountain. I don't know for how much longer, but the king gets the nod despite some flaws.
Bama bias wins out once again. That's the headline here. And it does. And there is bias. And a lot of that bias has been well earned by Alabama over the years under Nick Saban. But you can look at it however you want. This is a projection. This is not what have you done. It's some sort of weird combination that I don't exactly know the percentages of what have you done with what do we think you're going to do. How can we project what you're going to do? Well, the projection of the network partners carrying the games is that Alabama at Notre Dame will be a ratings bonanza. Not that the first round wasn't going to be good ratings-wise for all the games. This will be a mammoth game for eyeballs of Bama and Notre Dame. So projecting what we think will happen, what we think you are. Well, I'll give you a couple projections. In 2 games this year that Alabama lost, they lost those games by a combined 26 points. The projection was they were going to win those games by a combined 36 points. They lost at Vanderbilt, and they lost at Oklahoma by 21 points in a game where they were a 12.5-point favorite. That's a 62-point difference between projection and what happened in those games. So what happened should matter and does matter. And the fact that Alabama has 3 losses is why they're hanging on the edge with a number of other 3-loss teams that also have their warts because they have 3 losses. But to hear Ward Manuel twist himself into a pretzel explaining the Bama pick while nitpicking and selectively choosing the bad spots of other teams is remarkable. Bama's bad losses I just mentioned, they don't matter to Ward Manuel, but In his interviews, he pointed out Ole Miss's bad loss to Kentucky. And while Miami has only lost to 2 teams that both have winning records, and one is ranked in the college football playoff ranking, another one is close but is not, because both those losses happened recently, suddenly that's a problem. And so they're out. Again, tie goes to the Tide. Always. They're going to find a way to get Alabama in. Now, that gets me thinking, why don't we just go back to the BCS model and have a computer decide and not have humans decide this? Well, let's look at what the BCS model would have done. Here is the simulated BCS versus the college football playoff. And what you find is that Alabama would be in the exact same spot. Now, Tennessee and SMU would swap, so Tennessee got a bit of a favored glance here if you're looking at computer model versus college football playoff ranking. But 11 for Alabama in the computers, 11 for Alabama there. So I'm saying all this to say that there is an argument for Alabama at number 11. But there's an argument for Miami to get that last spot. There's an argument for South Carolina. There's an impassioned argument by Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss also. In fact, Lane Kiffin answered the call recently because Miami, their football program, tweeted out their credentials. And let's get to Miami's credentials first. Miami's credentials posted, here's everything that they, one of only 12 Power 4 schools, or to win Power 4 teams. 7 wins versus Power 4 teams. 3-0 versus teams in strength rankings 1 through 3. All these things that, mean something, but again, nitpicking to show that they have the strongest possible case. Well, Dennis Dodd said, it's on Miami football, your move, Lane Kiffin. To which Lane Kiffin replies and says the following. You guys actually meet for days and come up with these rankings? College football playoff, do you actually watch the quality of players, teams, and road environments? We played in one of yours this year, and he has a bunch of Z's. They played at Wake Forest. Or just try and make the ACC feel relevant. A game, Hutton, by the way, that was on the CW. By the way, one of your teams paid us not to play again next year. Same number 12 spot you guys had Clemson ranked last week. How did that go against the SEC? Rewatch Georgia-Clemson closely if you want a reminder of the 2 conferences. Hashtag spot the ball anywhere. And at ACC football, hashtag remember take a knee. And that is a clear shot at Mario Cristobal in Miami. So you got this kind of mean girls back and forth going between conferences, between coaches, programs, accounts, saying all these things. But the end result ends up being Alabama, which Heather Dinich knew, which we knew on this show. We predicted that was going to be the case. If there's going to be a tie, if other teams are going to put themselves in a position to be tied with Bama in the loss column, Bama will win. 2 years ago, Tennessee and Bama had the same amount of losses, and Tennessee beat Alabama head-to-head. And who went to the playoff? Of course, the Alabama Crimson Tide wins again, which brings me back to someone that is gone but will never be forgotten, and someone I wish could chime in today on the state of affairs of the College Football Playoff Committee. Lucky for us, the great Mike Leach, RIP, has chimed in before on exactly what will happen with a playoff committee deciding it. And here is Mike Leach.
Say, I know what, let's have a committee, because why not? Because, we're American, we love committees. Let's get us a committee. Well, who should be on the committee? Well, I don't know. This guy's a good guy. Let's have him on the committee. Well, there's people on the committee that don't even have remote associations with football, nor have they at any level other than being a fan. But you know what? Let's have them on a committee. Why not? And then, it'd be fun. We'd go to that resort. We could talk, we could hang out at dinner, and then we'll decide which 4 teams should go. Because you know why? We don't need to solve this on the field, because we're the ones that know. And then, if we're going to do it that way, we should just ask them at the beginning of the season, just go ahead and you guys vote on it, figure out 1, 2, 3, and 4, and why even have the games? To me, that's not a playoff. There's nothing playoff about it. And this is even if we make it. Even if we make it, my thoughts don't change. How can you call it a playoff when there's 4 teams Conference champions don't even necessarily make the playoffs because you know why? Because the committee knew better.
And there's Mike Leach. He knew. The committee knew. Now, if you don't want Bama in the playoff and you're upset about this, well, if you're Ole Miss, you can come back and you can say, Ole Miss, don't lose to Florida, and especially don't lose at home to Kentucky. You lose 3 games, you put yourself in a compromising position where there's not much you can really bitch about. And it's not going to stop Lane Kiffin from doing it. Shane Beamer just took the podium. He's pissed off that the committee said there's nothing that can happen this week to change who's going to be in the playoff, and that he doesn't understand that because if Clemson wins, well, they won on the home field of the ACC champion. You lose 3 games, you put yourself in a compromising spot. Unless you're Bama. Because if you lose 3 games and you're Bama, tie goes to the Tide. And that's what happened once again.
Well, and we heard a lot to break down here. So, we heard from Ward Manuel. And here's how they selected Alabama. Again, it's very subjective. They can come up with the formula that they want to here as a group. It's what he said after the rankings came out. Why Alabama over Miami? It really came down to Alabama 3-1 versus current top 25 teams. Miami was 0-1. Alabama 6-1 against teams over 500. Miami 4-2. The over 500 mark is crucial in why they select Bama over Miami. They came up with this within the room. Alabama 6-1 against teams over 500. Teams over 500 is, I wonder why you draw the line at over 500. 7-5, keep in mind, 7-5 versus 6-6. And it's because of, if you want to just get Bama in there, it's because of their record against teams that are 6-6 or below. They're 3-2 against teams that are 6-6 or have a losing record this season. That's the critical part of the argument they're making versus not making. And it goes back to what I mentioned yesterday. The attention, this goes across the board, not just with Alabama. I think they absolutely focus on losses, the number of losses. But they also focus on not your worst loss, your best loss. That's why Ohio State's ahead of Tennessee right now. They have valued the 1-point loss to Oregon more than they value Tennessee's loss to Georgia. And look at Alabama's best loss versus best win. The best loss would be what, Tennessee?
Yeah.
And their best
7-point loss.
And their
Tennessee.
best win is Georgia. So when you start stacking the pairings of wins and losses and where their metric of strength and schedule equals, Bama's going to have a lot of the green instead of the red. And that's what they're focused on more. Who did you lose to and why, and the circumstances behind it. They're not focused on Oklahoma as much as they're focused on Tennessee in this mind, because they're saying over 500. Their record versus teams over 500. Their one loss is Tennessee there, which is, again,
it's very selective because their other 2 losses were to 2 6-6 teams, right, with Oklahoma and Vandy.
Right, and then they're pointing out Miami. And this is how they're saying the strength of schedule. The over 500 opponents, they're 6-1. That's Bama. Miami's 0-1 against their top 25. That's where they have their own. That's the strength of schedule where it comes into play.
Yeah, and trying to decide between, let's say, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Miami, I brought it up, but these are taken from different answers that I pulled these answers. It was no mention of Bama losing to Vandy and losing to Oklahoma in any of the answers.
Right.
But there was a mention of Ole Miss's awful loss at home to Kentucky, and there was a mention of, while Miami lost to good teams in Syracuse and Georgia Tech, both on the road, those happened in 2 of the last 3 weeks. So we factored that in. So now the last 3 games matters, but Bama losing by 21 points at Oklahoma 2 weeks ago, not this last week, the week before, magically is not brought up and doesn't matter to the committee. Now, I'm sure that came up by someone on the committee, and Ward Manuel and his short answers he's giving doesn't have time to go through every element and factor they look at when deciding these rankings.
Right.
But it's just another example of we can sit here and cherry pick any resume however we want. But we knew going into this that the cherry picking was going to favor Alabama. And I hate that it was so predictable. I do hate it. Now, I'm not going to sit here and make some passionate plea as to why Alabama does not belong in over Miami or Ole Miss or South Carolina. Those are for fans of those schools to make that argument. I think they all have a case to get in, and I think they all have a big case to not be in. All of them. But, Hutton, we kind of knew this was preordained, that it was going to, if it was close and you let them make a decision in a close way because of all these teams with 3 losses, or even now Miami with 2, it was Bama that was going to get the nod.
Right. And it's not, just keep in mind, and this is very specific from the reporters that have gone and been through like the trial run to see what it's like in the room. They are told specifically, this is not most deserving. This is best team. That's what their mindset is focused on, best team. So with that in mind, all of these numbers and comparisons and strength of schedule versus margin of victory, which by the way is capped at 24 points, margin of victory, all these different things, that would be what you need to make the argument for most deserving. They're looking at and projecting best team based on where you are currently right now. They're judging Miami and Bama against their current top 25 within that room. So I mentioned the 6-6 or losing record. Bama's record is 3-2. Miami's 6-0 against teams like that. But that ends up hurting them because they're focused on the record of teams with a winning record currently. And that's where the strength of schedule metric comes in. They're looking at that number, and then they go to best loss, however they want to define that. And that's based on where you are in the rankings. Best loss. They don't look at your worst loss immediately. It absolutely comes into play, but, I mean, the ACC shouldn't be shocked by this. You know, you've got everyone clamoring for and it's not going to change. It's not like they can move teams up. Bama's going to be in. They also specified this last night where the quote was from Ward Manuel, teams that are not playing, talking about this weekend, teams that are not playing cannot be adjusted where they are compared to other teams that are not playing. So if Texas loses to Georgia, that will be addressed, and that could affect where things line up. But Miami, all of a sudden, based on the arguments being made, they're not going to go into the room on Saturday and Sunday morning and say, okay, we're going to flip-flop them now. That's not going to happen. And we saw this last year. Different scenario with Florida State being left out. But that's also why Tennessee didn't get the nod over Bama, because Hendon Hooker was hurt.
Yeah.
And in this case, Bama's not playing. They're guaranteed to be in now.
But applying that same logic, the Jordan Travis at Florida State, the Hendon Hooker at Tennessee,
right.
Who's the best team right now? We talked about this on Monday. Who's the best team right now?
Of the pod?
I'm going to take the team that has won 6 straight games, and their last loss was by 3 points at Alabama, and just one at Clemson, and that's South Carolina. And if we want to play the quarterback game, if we can kind of pick and choose, well, Lenora Sellers wasn't available in the second half against LSU in a game they would have won.
You're right.
With Lenora Sellers. And then now they're 10-2, and there's no debate. We're talking about what seed they're going to get and if they're in the playoff or not. So I just don't know how anyone can look at that and say the team that just lost by 3 touchdowns and scored a field goal in a game against Oklahoma is better than the one that's coming in with 6 straight wins and barely lost to that other team on the road.
Right.
I mean, South Carolina is the best team of that bunch. And I would argue that over Ole Miss. I'd argue it over Miami. I'd argue it over Alabama.
So Nicole Auerbach, I put South Carolina.
But if you just look at the body of work, if we don't look at where games were played, when they were played, all that, then, there's an argument for Alabama over South Carolina. But if it's who's the best team right now, it's South Carolina.
Yeah, currently. And Nicole Auerbach, who's also covered much like Heather did it, she's all over the college football
she
playoff
is a
selection.
Big Ten reporter now for NBC Sports.
She says the committee has been very consistent about head-to-head results. South Carolina is boxed out by its losses to Alabama and Ole Miss. Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Bama at one point was ahead of Tennessee.
By 4 spots.
And you had the head-to-head factor in there, too. It is what happens recently.
Yeah, but with the same amount of losses, they were 4 spots ahead of Tennessee.
Right, and it is. I mean, what happens most recent will affect you. I mean, Miami losing certainly is detrimental, but we're not that far. We're not that far past the loss to Oklahoma. You know, one win over Auburn does not reset what we just saw.
A 28-14 blah win at home over a bad Auburn team doesn't reset. Not scoring a touchdown. It's not that they lost
Right.
They lost 24-3 in a game that should have been 38-0.
Yes.
They got housed by a below average Oklahoma team. We're just completely crimson washing that away. But didn't happen. We're just going to look at their body of work, and we believe Alabama's the better team. I don't think that's right. I think South Carolina's the better team right now. But now we're just getting into projections of what we think, and the projection's always going to be Alabama's better because they're Alabama and because they're going to deliver a bigger TV rating, especially if it's Alabama and Notre Dame in round one.
No doubt. And hey, let's also mention, like in the room, the committee, you don't have to be unanimous with how these rankings stack up. It's much like the OutKick top 12. Look at here. I didn't have Miami or Bama in my top 12, but Miami's in the top 12 from the projections of what we had and released on Monday. So again, it's representative of the consensus, not the unanimous. So I would like to know, and we won't know because it's all off the record, anonymous, how things would stack up within that room versus how close the vote really was. But Chad, if it's Bama and Miami, if the argument is record against teams with a winning record, there's no comparison. But the body of work, and I mentioned this from week 0, the body of work should be more of a factor than what it is. And we don't have to go back that far to see Bama stub their toe again. They nearly lost. They should have lost, quite frankly, to South Carolina. But, I don't think the way that you win games not just Bama, I don't think the way that you win games is factored in enough. And I was using the example of NC State and how they squeaked by, the nonprofit organization, whoever they played.
Western Carolina.
Yeah.
I think it was in week 1.
But at that point, they were factoring into the ACC title, much like Florida State.
And they finished 6-6.
Yeah, no doubt. But I'm looking at it going, we should just keep note of how teams play versus what their record is. And Bama has been very inconsistent. However, that's been the narrative of a lot of teams. And many people go to this. I know the BCS has them in too. But what would Vegas have on a neutral field? Bama and Miami as the spread.
That's a good question.
I bet Bama's favored. Not by much.
Not by much.
Close to a pick'em. Not by much, but they're favored.
If I was going to give an argument for Miami, one, it's they have fewer losses, which for a while that's kind of what the committee would look at, right? They're 10-2.
Right.
Bama and these other teams are 9-3. I think the committee clearly looked at common opponent, and that's how they got Miami over Ole Miss, because Miami spanked Florida on the road, and Ole Miss just lost to Florida on the road, and that's the one common opponent between the two. So they favored Miami over them. Miami is consistent on offense. That's the one thing I'll say for them. They're the best offense in America. They average 44 points per game. They didn't have a bad offensive game with Cam Ward. So at least you can go into it saying, we know what Miami is offensively. Now, defensively, they're wildly inconsistent. Alabama's wildly inconsistent on both sides of the ball. They had defensive performances that were head-scratchers too. Then they have offensive performances like the one in Norman, Oklahoma. So at least with Miami, the offense is consistently great. You can hang your hat on that with them. I don't know with Alabama. I feel good about all the NFL players in the roster. At times they look great, but they're inconsistent on all sides.
No doubt. And then they even have some issues where they're, throwing things on the mouthpiece on the field or, refusing to come out of the game. That was at Vandy, with one of their captains. They overcame that because they're in the playoff. But I'll say, it can't just be about who has fewer losses. Because if that's the case, Army should be in with their record. They've only lost one time as a top 25 team.
No, it can't be just about that. Indiana would be higher. They have one loss.
Yeah, yes. So you have to have some subjective thought in the process of best team. But, this is also why I love this new system that we have. Because otherwise, it would be more or less your typical 4 teams in. And the top of the cream of the crop from the conferences that have been inconsistent at best or haven't played the best schedule. Whatever argument you want to make there, at least we're arguing about Bama over Miami instead of Bama over an unbeaten Florida State.
It's been a giant win. Regardless of what we're talking about and the issues with it and all that, it's a huge win for the sport. And I think everyone, once you get over the upset feelings, everyone can admit, even South Carolina, who's pissed off today, Ole Miss, Miami, whoever,
Sure.
If you're a fan of those schools, you can admit once this settles down, boy, it was still great to be in the conversation. It was fun to have that thought that maybe we're going to get in or have our team, even after 3 losses, still be relevant to compete for a national title is really cool if you're a fan. So it's a net positive for everyone. Let's flash the actual bracket again one more time. If you really want to get sick to your stomach about Bama bias, it's that not only are they in, and I'm not poo-pooing Notre Dame and what they've done or any of that. That's going to be a tough game for them. But Alabama having Notre Dame and SMU possibly between them and the Final Four of this with 3 losses is pretty sickening. When you look at Tennessee and Ohio State, Tennessee with 2 losses beat Bama head-to-head. And Ohio State with 2 losses, 1-point loss at the only undefeated team in the country, and then a loss in a rivalry game. They're going to have to beat the other one and then go to Eugene, Oregon to face the lone unbeaten team in America to get to a Final Four. So not only are they in, but I'm not saying Notre Dame's an easy game on the road. That's a favorable path compared to some others. The best path out there is Penn State.
And they don't reseed.
If we're looking at it right now.
Yeah, so this is exactly why they want Bama in. This is it's not the first round matchup. It's a massive game. But it's the second round. Because if it's South Carolina as the best team pulls the upset over Notre Dame, you have South Carolina and SMU as your quarterfinal matchup on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. They don't want that.
No.
They want one of the brands in against SMU. That is the aspect of it I overlooked yesterday. The second round and the matchups that they could potentially have, they don't want duds like they've had in the 14 playoff, where the margin of victory was very lopsided in many cases. We saw some classic games, but those were few and far between. And in this case, you still have the brand names, and they want travel partners. They want fan bases that travel for these massive games. Rose Bowl, Cotton Bowl, Fiesta Bowl, Orange Bowl. Who am I leaving out? I mean, those are the tent pole bowl games that they wanted for the college football playoff last go around, and now they've expanded those, and it all leads to Atlanta. They don't want, even though it could be a great game, by and large, I mean, there's a reason why at the Final Four for college hoops, they've stacked the best game in the second tip-off.
Yeah.
They don't want a game that's automatically going to be the day you kick off the day with
the bad game. South Carolina SMU would become a footnote for years from now.
No doubt.
About this is the worst second round playoff game ratings wise since South Carolina SMU. Yeah. It's that type of game. The other damnation scenario would be Arizona State beating Penn State and Arizona State Boise State in a second round game, which would be terrible ratings wise.
And let me go ahead and mention, it doesn't have to be South Carolina. To put in Ole Miss against SMU, Miami against SMU. There's a different vibe to that than Notre Dame or Bama and what they bring to the table. So Bama's there. That's where the Bama bias absolutely comes in for me. But also, how much longer can Bama do this with what we saw this year? So if you're totally against Bama bias and you believe in what we're discussing here, that can't go on for much longer given their track record of what we've seen over the recent years. And even the penalties and everything, that was stacking up against Saban. With Saban out now and DeBoer, the shine is off. Bama fans are clamoring, what is going on with the shell shock of how they were playing.
Yeah.
If they continue to play the way they played this year, they're not going to receive this type of treatment moving forward.
I'm shocked.
You agree?
I agree. Going into the season, I would have said there's going to be a 9-3 SEC team that gets in or a 9-3 Big Ten team.
Right.
And maybe 2 because of how competitive the schedules are going to be. And then once you get to that 10, 11, 12 spot, you're going to have more 3-loss teams. Hutton 3 weeks ago going into that chaotic Saturday in the SEC, we were sitting there looking at possible 10-2 SEC teams getting left out, right?
Yes.
We're trying to say, there could be 2 10-2 SEC teams that get left out. Then all that chaos happens, and then suddenly if you're going to finish 10-2, you're going to be in the college football playoff. Yet Bama, even after that horrific loss at Oklahoma, they still find their way in as the 1-9-3 team.
Okay.
to get in. It's just,
And here's the other convenience of it.
it's crazy kismet that always seems to pay off for Alabama.
We had a topic last week or the week prior about how many teams the SEC would get in. More than 4? Would they get 5? I said 4. Very convenient when you look at this. There's 4 Big Ten and 4 SEC teams in.
Mm-hmm.
Very even. The teams that would be hosting: Penn State, Ohio State, Notre Dame, Georgia. That's where the lopsided aspect comes in. Well, the home game opponents versus the SEC opponents that they get. Tennessee on the road in Big Ten country, Alabama on the road, Big Ten country, and then you have Big Ten going to Georgia. But that's how things stacked up for that specific. And things can change. Not necessarily, Bama's not going to fall out of the bracket. Tennessee's not going to fall out of the bracket. But what happens this weekend, they can maneuver seeds more so than what they're saying. They're saying you won't be there.
There can be movement within the bracket.
Yes, but not a team behind you that's out of the bracket
Right.
jumping in. So do they even out the home games as well? Again, I'm looking at it from that. It's very even between the two partners that control everything right now. The other conferences are taking far less money to be a part of this. And, well, they don't have a home game. That's my other point of this.
We were on Clay's in the air, not going to be able to join us today, but we were on a group text with Clay, and I think I can say this on our text. He referred to it as horse trading between the Big Ten and the SEC for that spot. That in return for getting Alabama in as the 4th, you get 4 and 4 from each conference. The cost of that was, well, now Ohio State definitely gets a home game. And that Tennessee-Ohio State question is no longer a question. That Tennessee is going to be ranked behind them to go on the road to Columbus, and not the reverse of that, because that would be too much in favor of the SEC. And that was the cost of getting Alabama in at the back end.
So you have 2 and 1 right now. Notre Dame is also going to be served well because they're taking less. They cannot host. They can't get a bye in this process, and they're taking less money as the independent than the SEC and Big Ten teams for the guarantees of getting in. You get the same amount of money for the games that you play in and then advance. So Boise and Oregon and SMU and Texas, currently, they're guaranteed already the $8 million payout just for getting the bye. It's counted as a win. So, again, the money matters. And when you look at it's an even split plus Notre Dame. That's exactly how things were set up. And that's what the other conferences feared. But they went along with it because they had to be a factor in getting the money for where the payout is, and the payout is this bracket.
Yeah.
To me, it's no coincidence that it's Bama, but it's also an SEC school that evens out where they would be over the ACC getting an extra team in. Let me also mention this: what we see on Sunday. I think there's this perception of like, oh, we're going to find out if where the committee stands on this, how they view certain aspects of how they're choosing teams, and what it is that comes down to the final vote. And they're going to set a precedent for moving. We're going to figure things out. I'm not so sure. Now, when you look at the committee members, they rotate in and out after 3 years. You serve on the committee for 3 years. They stagger this, so you always have carryover, much like, election season, where this year, more than years past, there's going to be a lot of carryover from inside the room. I believe, let me count this up quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 9 of the 13 will be back next year, if they want to be. The committee members that are transitioning out, Ward Manuel, this is his only year as the chair, because Boo Corrigan, who his final year was last year, he's been the chair 2 years prior, but Ward Manuel, 1 year chair, served 3 years. You have Gladchuck, the AD at Navy, Jim Grove, and Will Shields. They've all served now. This is their 3rd year. Beyond that, there is a lot. There are a lot of ADs, several coaches, and they even have, did you know there's a sports media professor in the room?
No.
Kelly Whiteside, a sports media professor.
Is she on the committee?
At Montclair St. College. She is one of the 3. One of the 13.
I know her vote went for.
One of the 13. Sports media.
The sports media vote for Alabama. I would like to cast my vote for the Tide.
How you're chosen, I mean, they have a organization staff. They have the group that make sure that everything's running smoothly. It's basically a representative. It's a president from all of the conferences in Division I is what it is. But beyond that, they have two guys who are running things, boots on the ground, and I guess that's how they nominate people to be on this committee. But they're going to have they say a vast array of those that are rotating in and out. One of them is a sports media professor.
Well, let's
at
play
Montclair
sports
State
media
College.
professor right here, right now. We can go ahead and do this for them.
Yeah.
Here's how we'd order it in slotting for media purposes. What are the most interesting games that are going to be the highest rated for the best time slots?
Okay.
It's Alabama, Notre Dame. It's Tennessee, Ohio State.
Sure.
It's Indiana, Georgia. It's Arizona State, Penn State, in that order. Boom, done. Montclair State media relations person. We just did the job for you. Media rights. What media expert?
Yeah, it's a sports media and journalism professor.
We could split up that job and do it for
and they're
them.
going to have, moving forward, they could have a media member, like someone that covers the sport prominently. They could be on the committee. Again, I don't know how you qualify and get how you're introduced to receive a vote to get on this panel. But
I would
it's a
be all
3-year
for
commitment.
that only
You don't get paid,
because
by the
of
way.
the transparency if a media member was on it. I would love that if they were allowed to report on everything said.
But yes, they can do that, I guess. But they can't. They really don't know how the vote went because it's anonymous. You don't know who voted for who.
Just true details
Big
about
Brother.
every discussion would be incredible.
Well, the only thing we have right now, the window that we have is just for those that went through like the mock version of this. So just, I don't know how much of this one bracket that we have on Sunday will factor into how we see things next year, because you have the big voices on this panel, a lot of ADs that are not going to be a part of it next year, but they're probably replaced by others who may view things different,
Yeah. If you're in a major conference, plan on going 10-2. And if you do that, you should be okay. That's the lesson we learned. That's the hard and fast rule. 10-2 or better.
Yeah. And by the way, let's show the top 25 briefly again. When we expand to 16, the argument's going to be about Iowa State. Well, they're going to be in. The winner's going to be in. So it's going to be South Carolina, Clemson, BYU, Missouri. That's where we're headed. So, again, I love the discussion and what it's created.
Which is also really cool because South Carolina, Clemson would have essentially been a play-in game.
Yeah.
You're looking right around that range where South Carolina's in, Clemson's out, unless they were to win the ACC.
Yep. Syracuse would be arguing right now instead of Miami for their win. Colorado would be clamoring. And then you stack it however you want to as a committee.
Yeah. UNLV would be sitting there thinking, if we win this Mountain West title and beat Boise State, we should launch ourselves into the back of the 16-team playoff.
Yeah, they would be arguing they should get a bye.
Double bye for the running Rebs.